At 29,029 feet, the human body is not living. It is dying. Physiologists call this altitude the death zone. The air is so thin that your brain begins to swell, pushing against the skull. Your lungs can fill with fluid, drowning you from the inside. Your blood thickens like sludge, struggling to carry warmth to your extremities. In this place, time is your greatest enemy. Every second you spend above 26,000 feet is a second borrowed from your own mortality. And on May 10, 1996, for 33 climbers on Mount Everest, time ran out. This is the true story of the 1996 Everest disaster. It is a story of ambition, hubris, commercialism, and the terrifying power of nature. It is a story where the line between life and death was erased by a storm that no one saw coming. But more than anything, it is a story of survival against the odds. To understand why 1996 became the deadliest season in Everest's history up to that point, we must first look at how the mountain had changed. For decades, Everest was the realm of elite mountaineers, men and women who had dedicated their lives to the craft of climbing. But by the mid-90s, a new industry had emerged: commercial mountaineering. The summit of the world was no longer just for the skilled, it was for anyone with $65,000 and a dream. Two men stood at the center of this new era. On one side was Rob Hall, a 35-year-old New Zealander and the head of Adventure Consultants. Hall was meticulous, calculated, and deeply respected. He had summited Everest 4 times, more than any other non-Sherpa climber at the time. His reputation was built on safety. He famously told his clients, "I will hold your hand and I will get you to the top." He was the corporate face of climbing, organized, disciplined, and cautious. On the other side was Scott Fischer, the founder of Mountain Madness. Fischer was an American, a wild spirit with a ponytail and a magnetic personality. He was the rock star of the Himalayas. While Hall was about control, Fischer was about freedom. He believed in letting climbers find their own strength. He claimed he had built a yellow brick road to the summit. But despite their differences, both men were under immense pressure. The competition for clients was fierce. John Krakauer, a journalist for Outside Magazine, was on Hall's team to write a story about the commercialization of the mountain. If Hall could get Krakauer to the top, the publicity would be priceless. Fischer, a newcomer to the Everest guiding game, needed a successful season to establish his business. This pressure created a dangerous invisible weight. It pushed them to ignore the red flags that the mountain was showing them. In the weeks leading up to the summit push, the signs were there. The weather was unstable. The acclimatization process was grueling. Clients were struggling. Among Hall's team was Doug Hansen, a postal worker from Washington State. Hansen had tried to summit with Hall the previous year, but had been turned back just meters from the top. He had worked 2 jobs to afford this second chance. Hall felt a deep personal responsibility to get Doug to the top this time. That emotional attachment would prove to be a fatal flaw in a place that demands cold logic. On the Mountain Madness team, Scott Fischer was exhausting himself. He was moving up and down the mountain, fixing problems, carrying loads, and taking care of a sick client. By the time the summit window opened, Fischer was physically drained, a dangerous state for a lead guide. The plan for the summit bid was set for May 10th. Both teams, along with the Taiwanese expedition, would push for the top on the same day. This meant over 30 climbers would be trying to navigate the narrow, treacherous ridges of the upper mountain at the same time. They departed Camp 4 at the South Col just before midnight. The South Col is a desolate plateau of ice and rock at 26,000 feet. It is the launching pad for the final assault. As they climbed into the darkness, the conditions seemed perfect. The sky was clear, filled with stars. The wind was calm. It felt like the mountain was welcoming them. But delays began almost immediately. When the lead climbers reached the balcony, a staging area at 27,600 feet, they discovered that the fixed ropes had not been installed. This was a critical error. For over an hour, clients stood around in the freezing cold, burning through their precious oxygen supplies, waiting for the guides and Sherpas to fix the lines. This bottleneck cost them time they did not have. Rob Hall had a strict rule. 2 o'clock in the afternoon is the turnaround time. If you haven't reached the summit by 2, you turn around and go down. No exceptions. This rule is the difference between life and death. It ensures you have enough daylight and oxygen to return to the safety of Camp 4. But on this day, the rule was broken. As the climbers moved higher, they hit another bottleneck at the Hillary Step, a 40-foot vertical rock face just below the summit. Again, there were no ropes. The crowd of climbers grew. The line stalled. Valuable minutes turned into hours. John Krakauer reached the summit at 1:17 in the afternoon. He noticed wispy clouds forming in the valleys below, but he didn't think much of it. He took his photos and began his descent. But as he moved down, he passed a long line of climbers still going up. They were late. Dangerously late. Rob Hall was near the back of the pack, shepherding Doug Hansen. Hansen was struggling. He was exhausted, barely able to put one foot in front of the other. But Hall wouldn't leave him. They continued upward, past the 2 o'clock deadline, past 3 o'clock. They didn't reach the summit until 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They had achieved their dream, but they had sealed their fate. Scott Fischer arrived late as well. He looked terrible. His face was gaunt, his movements sluggish. He summited around 3:30, but instead of celebrating, he simply turned around and began to descend. He knew he was in trouble. While the leaders were still high on the summit ridge, the clouds that Krakauer had seen earlier exploded upward. It wasn't just a storm, it was a rogue blizzard of historic ferocity. The wind speed jumped to over 70 miles per hour. The temperature plunged to 40 degrees below zero. Visibility dropped to 0. It was a whiteout. For the climbers descending, the world disappeared. The fixed ropes were buried under snow. Their tracks were erased instantly. They were blind, freezing, and running out of oxygen. On the South Col, a group of climbers, including the experienced guide Neil Badelman, became lost in the whiteout. They were only a few hundred meters from the tents of Camp 4, but in the screaming wind and darkness, they couldn't find them. They wandered until they collapsed from exhaustion. They huddled together in the snow, a tangled mass of limbs trying to share body warmth. Among them was Yasuko Namba, a 47-year-old Japanese woman who had just become the oldest woman to summit Everest, and Beck Weathers, a pathologist from Texas. Beck Weathers had a different problem. He had undergone eye surgery prior to the trip, and the low pressure at high altitude had blinded him. He had been waiting for hours on the ridge for a guide to take him down. Now he was caught in the middle of a superstorm, blind and freezing. High above, near the summit, the situation was catastrophic. Rob Hall and Doug Hansen were stuck at the Hillary Step. Hansen had collapsed. He had no oxygen left and could not move. Hall refused to leave him. This loyalty, while heroic, was a death sentence. On the radio, Hall communicated with base camp. He sounded calm, but the situation was desperate. He couldn't drag Hansen down the technical rock face in a blizzard. Meanwhile, Scott Fischer was collapsing further down the ridge. He sat down and couldn't get back up. The Sherpas tried to move him, but he was unresponsive. He was suffering from high-altitude cerebral edema, or HACE. His brain was swelling. He told the Sherpa to leave him and save himself. As night fell, the mountain became a graveyard. The climbers huddled on the South Col were slowly dying. The wind was stripping the heat from their bodies. Yasuko Namba's breathing became shallow. Beck Weathers lost his gloves. His hands froze instantly, becoming like blocks of wood. He slipped into a hypothermic coma. When the storm cleared slightly the next morning, a rescue team was sent out from Camp 4. They found the group of huddled climbers. Some were able to walk with assistance, but when the rescuers looked at Yasuko Namba and Beck Weathers, they saw no signs of life. They were covered in ice, their skin pale and hard. The decision was made. They were beyond help. To try and drag them back would only risk the lives of the survivors. They were left for dead. High up on the mountain, Doug Hansen had disappeared, likely fallen from the ridge during the night. Rob Hall was still alive, but barely. He had survived a night exposed at 28,000 feet without oxygen, a feat that defies medical explanation. But his hands and feet were frozen. He couldn't move. In one of the most heartbreaking moments in mountaineering history, Base Camp patched a radio call through from Rob Hall to his wife Jan Arnold, who was pregnant with their first child back in New Zealand. Hall knew he wasn't coming down. He didn't tell her the full extent of his condition to protect her. He simply said, "Sleep well, my sweetheart. Please don't worry too much." Those were his last words. His body remains on the mountain to this day. Scott Fischer also never woke up. He died on the ridge, his body eventually tethered to the mountain he loved. But on the South Col, something impossible was happening.